Good afternoon, fellow patriots. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to Patriot Radio, broadcasting live from deep inside the heart of the future Liberty State. Sponsored once again by On Fire Ministries in the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story and the news behind the news, where it's not about right or left, it's about right and wrong. It's about our hope not being in man, but in Jesus Christ. About not ending in prayer, but moving to action. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Father, deliver us from the evil one.
Welcome to Patriot Radio.
Good afternoon, fellow patriots. Israel looking like it's going to annex Gaza as Hamas steps away from the negotiating table. And our guest today, Robert Spencer from Jihad Watch, talking about the implications of what's happening in Israel, the continued jihadi attacks in Europe, and what that means for the United States of America. Here at Patriot Radio, we want you to have all of the information you need first before anyone else, so you and your family can be prepared for the times that are ahead and the times that are already upon us. So follow us on Telegram at patriotradio.us for real-time intelligence analysis and breaking news. Go ahead and like some of those articles as well, so we know you're out there. Very helpful, and it drives up the engagement. Also, we are in a time of prayer. All of us know that. We actually take prayer very seriously here at Patriot Radio, and we would love to pray for you. patriotradio.us/prayer. And for those of you that read the word and really kind of want to know what to do in this time, you've heard me many times say that we need to be exposing the evil that we are seeing all around us. That's a duty, it's a command of Christians to do that. Not to cover for the evil, but to expose it. I'm asking the Lord the timing and how. That's key in our prayer life. There's a scripture that I want to read in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 6. Abandon your foolishness and live, and proceed in the way of understanding. One who corrects a scoffer gets dishonor for himself, and one who rebukes a wicked person gets insults for himself. So when we're talking about exposing evil, we're not talking about rebuking the wicked. We're not even talking about correcting a scoffer as such, unless you have been given authority to speak into their life. But it is government's job to bring justice. That is one of the things that is clear throughout Scripture and actually Jewish teaching and tradition throughout recorded history. And I think all of us today want justice here in the United States of America for the attempted coup against President Trump in his first term, and trying to continue that coup even to now. The attempt to infiltrate non-citizens into the United States to sway elections. The attempt to undermine the Constitution and really their stated goal of overthrowing the Constitution. This red communist, green jihadi, and now, as Alex Newman has put it, blue or globalist axis. So with this, understand our job is to expose evil. It's a command. And there's going to be a lot of evil that's being exposed here in the next 90 days. And for all of us to stick together as Christians, we should intercede for people. But we should also push back the darkness. That brings us now to your daily intelligence briefing, coming to us from the globalist front.
The future is built by us. We have the means to make progress on the global agenda.
Smart meters, well, as we, I think, all know now, is a tool of mass surveillance. There's a multitude of data revealed by your consumption patterns and energy signatures, all pumped up through your wireless meter to your utility. Your data is then sold to the highest bidder, including, you guessed it, law enforcement. So, it's important to understand when you see smart, replace that word with surveillance, because that's exactly what it is as they continue to add to your digital self to know you better than you think you know yourself and introduce stimulus, information to get you to behave a certain way. It was originally called activity-based intelligence. But even today, it's still the same stated goal, and that is control over people. Treasury Secretary Bessent said, quote, "There needs to be a fundamental reset for the Federal Reserve. All these PhDs over there, I don't know what they do." That was his harshest attack this year. But Scott Bessent may actually, and it might not be for the right motivations, be the one who actually presides over the changing of the Federal Reserve. And I think that that's exactly what Trump's doing, as you've heard on Mondays with Matt Geiger, founder of VERITY Metals, converttogold.com. He said very clearly that what they're trying to do is to reset the entire system. And what you're really trying, or what you're really seeing, what they're really trying to do is a shift. This is a now battle between the very wealthy. And that's when things can get very dicey. So we're going to keep our eyes on this into the future. Jerome Powell rejects fiscal concerns in Fed rate policy as the central bank holds steady, but right on the heels of that, leaving it unchanged and sitting in the 4.25 to 4.50 range, some interesting things are occurring. First of all, the two dissidents were Fed Vice Chair for Supervision Michelle Bowman and Governor Christopher Waller, making a rare occasion where dissent in voting was noted. So you're going to see some splits happening in the Fed. And as we just reported, Treasury Secretary Bessent saying there needs to be a fundamental reset. So now you're hearing U.S. senators coming out against the Federal Reserve, and specifically the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. Here, Rick Scott talking about $1.6 trillion in asset losses, $77.6 billion in operating losses, and $2.5 billion in luxury headquarters renovations. This is not the end. This is the beginning of the attempt not just to remove Jerome Powell, but I think this is an attempt to fundamentally restructure the Federal Reserve System and probably replace it. Now, I don't think it needs to be replaced. I think it should go back to the Treasury Secretary, which is where it belongs constitutionally, and this argument's been going on for 250 years. But the fact that these types of people are coming out against the Fed and being very open about it and very hopeful about a change tells me something is in the offing. And that should be really a red flag to be watching this, not a red flag the Federal Reserve is going to go away. I've talked about that for years. Total proponent for it. But it's something we need to be watching. So that brings us now to the China front. China faces global headwinds at the EU summit as it falls flat, and the BRICS summit. China's global ambitions are faltering. Low expectations for the European Union-Chinese meeting and Chinese leader Xi Jinping's absence for the BRICS summit highlight growing doubts about the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to lead a world order. When the EU delegation arrived in China for a summit with Xi on July 24th, they were met at Beijing Capital International Airport, not with the welcoming ceremony worthy of a state-level visit, with a shuttle bus. And the lackluster reception foreshadowed the underwhelming outcome of the summit. Yeah, China is struggling right now, and very likely Xi is losing control over the reins of power. That means that China is going to face increasing instability. Also, in a very sad note, and really a key anti-communist, governor of the Northern Mariana Islands passed away in Guam, Arnold Palacios, who actually just this last April was calling out the Chinese Communist Party infiltration of the Pacific Islands and calling for investigations. Quote, "It's in the interests of national and global security for the United States government to protect and fortify its Pacific territories and allies of the freely associated states of Micronesia against the growing threat of the Chinese Communist Party, he said during a 2023 committee hearing on natural resources. I find the timing of his death a little too coincidental, and there should be an investigation into that as well. China's false crusade for a multipolar world is really a bid for Beijing's dominance. The only problem is they're losing strength with a strong U.S. leader. In reality, China's vision of a multipolarity is one in which it stands at the top. At the Munich Security Conference of February 2025, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi declared, quote, "A multipolar world is not only a historical inevitability, it is also becoming a reality, calling for an equal and orderly multipolar world." Yeah, the Chinese want to have the influence, and they believe that they're going to dominate. That's why they're so upset with the election of President Trump. Thai soldiers celebrating after capturing the Cambodian army stronghold at Phu Ma Kua. Yeah, that's a mouthful right there. But the fact of the matter is that the Thai army, dominated over the Cambodians, as the tentative ceasefire, anyway, continues to hold. Also, interestingly enough, according to Forbes, bots now make up over 50% of all global internet traffic, many coming from China, Russia, and Iran. I wonder how that's going to be dealt with on places like X, because I know they constantly are sending the algorithm out and bots out to remove bot accounts. There's got to be a better solution because those bots are trying to influence global politics. That brings us to the Middle East front. For the first time ever, Arab and Muslim states, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar, joined the EU and others in calling on Hamas to disarm and relinquish control of Gaza, backing Palestinian Authority-led governance under international support. On the heels of that, Hamas has cut off contact with mediators, including Qatar and Egypt, and Israeli officials say negotiations are collapsing. Meanwhile, talks with Turkey reportedly continue, and the Israelis giving a timeline of annexing Gaza. I think this is going to continue. I think the Israelis are going to occupy Gaza, and they are going to annex it. Israel moves to sue the New York Times for $10 billion for the blood libel they spread. Specifically, that there's a starvation happening and using pictures of children that have diseases, not starving children, to try to sway international opinion. The United States and several European countries have released a joint statement condemning Iranian intelligence services for targeting journalists, dissidents, and officials in Europe and North America, calling Iran to immediately stop these illegal activities, which violate their sovereignty and threaten the safety of their people in their territories. It looks like the narrative war is ramping up for another strike against Iran, just saying. Iran is also facing a critical emergency. The president of Iran warned that uncontrolled water use is pushing the country toward collapse. Major cities like Tehran could see dam reservoirs run dry as soon as September. This isn't theory. The data is clear. Groundwater is vanishing and wells are already drying up. Very interesting that in prophetic words, in some of the ancient documents, the idea of famine and the idea of drought may be playing out right now in the Middle East. Let's pray for the Christians there. The U.S. has imposed sanctions on the Palestinian Authority and PLO officials, including denying visas for failing to meet requirements, as the pressure continues to mount in not just Gaza, but also in the West Bank. The IDF's Kafir brigade tightened control over the Magan Oz axis in Khan Yunis, arresting terrorists, uncovering a weapons depot, and destroying a large underground tunnel. I think this is just a precursor of that annexation that we just reported on. Also, according to Bloomberg, the Republic of Somaliland has offered the United States the opportunity. This is very key terrain here. This is right across the strait from the Houthis. They've offered the U.S. the opportunity to construct a naval base on its coast near the Bab al-Mandab Strait between the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, as well as a critical rare earth mineral deal in exchange for its recognition as an independent country from Somalia. Pretty incredible. We might actually see a geostrategic move here that could throw a huge wrench into the Iranian proxies that have been trying to dominate that part of the strait. This week, some interesting things have happened on the Russia-Ukraine front, and that's where we're going next. This week we had talks with the Russians and we saw no progress, according to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, harshly criticizing Putin and his inner circle, saying Trump has waited for over 6 months for signs of peaceful progress, but his patience is running out. Quote, what troubles the president most is that he has had excellent phone conversations where everyone says, yes, we want this to stop. Then he turns on the news and yet another city is bombed, even those far from the front lines. Rubio stressed that the U.S. sees no willingness from Russia to make peace and listed ways Trump could pressure Putin if he ignores the ultimatum, which prompted, of course, Dmitry Medvedev to come out and threaten Trump, and Trump responded by saying he is crossing into dangerous territory. Things ramping up there. And I don't think that the next 30 days are going to see this cool off either. Ireland 2025, a very sad, worrying image and damning indictment of what the establishment class has created for children of this land we call home. An Irish girl in a buggy witnesses an unprovoked terror attack. And if you haven't seen this video, it looks like a guy yelling in Arabic, stabbing a Garda police officer in Dublin while he was on patrol. We're going to talk a little bit more about this attack and what's happening in Europe with our guest today, Robert Spencer. Also, Trump threatens Russia's failed former president Medvedev. And like I said, this interesting, watch his words, this rhetoric is similar to before the United States struck Iran. I don't think the United States is going to strike Russia, but I do think that you're going to see some very overt attempts to pressure Vladimir Putin. In response, Ukrainian drone swarms just attacked 3 different locations at a rail hub in Volgograd region of Russia. Like we have been talking about the last week, there is now finally some attacks on Russian rail infrastructure, and I see that continuing into the fall, which will severely hamper the ability of the Russians to wage war in Ukraine. Also, an air traffic problem in the United Kingdom, an outage, halted flights at airports across the United Kingdom after this radar-related issue surfaced on Wednesday. Flights at major airports were disrupted for about 4 hours after a short 20-minute technical issue. Over 100 flights were canceled as a result. This is probably going to continue as cyber warfare ramps up, and particularly there in Europe. Germany and Italy saw economic contractions. The economies of Germany and Italy shrank in Q2, according to a new data report. Germany saw a contraction of 0.1%, mostly blamed upon U.S. tariff policy and the country's own struggling manufacturing sector. Italy shrank by 0.1% as well, most of which was blamed upon tariffs. Some people might think that this is bad, but there's actually a realignment because the United States has been subsidizing so many countries, and now things are being equalized. Trump punishes Brazil. Let's talk about the South America front. Trump punished Brazil with sweeping tariff sanctions, which Bolsonaro hails as not revenge, but justice. And the sanctions against the Supreme Court justice there in Brazil, who, looks like he dresses like a dictator too, on top of that, I think is going to at least give Brazil a pause in their continued repression and oppression of pro-U.S. allies. That brings us to the national front. A massive volcano exploded in Russia hours after tsunami waves rocked Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast. So right after this, Polymarket shot up that there would be a megaquake potentially by the end of August. And when we come back from the break, more from the national front. And finally, Joe Kent gets confirmed.
What if I told you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today.
And we're back on the national front. And as I was talking about before the break, this huge earthquake in Russia on the other side of the Ring of Fire portends another megaquake. And that could happen on this side, maybe off the coast of Oregon and Washington and Canada, British Columbia, Canada. So we're going to be watching this very carefully. Quake swarms underneath Mount Rainier and north of that have been recorded here recently as well. Not that that's necessarily out of the norm, but it's something that really is giving us pause and we should watch very carefully. Switching gears, the U.S. Treasury Secretary just sanctioned Cartel de los Celos as a terrorist group run by a corrupt and contemptible leader. Who is it? Well, of course, leader of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Also, ICE is looking to hire personnel and is offering a $50,000 signing bonus. A lot of people are taking that up. In fact, a lot of people who had stepped away from immigrations and customs enforcement started to come back because they've finally been empowered to do their jobs and protect the homeland. Also, Joe Kent was finally confirmed as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. This is a big appointment because he understands the threats to the United States of America, particularly from the communists and the jihadis. And so a key component of disrupting and dismantling these networks is who is in this role as director of the National Counterterrorism Center. And finally it happened. I just pray that the other appointments that have been held up start to get rammed through. Now, an interesting thing has come out, and I want to just preface this by saying that the redistricting efforts in Ohio, Florida, Texas, and then California, obviously saying they want to do it, is revolving around the fact that previous census numbers counted illegal immigrants on the census rolls when it was supposed to be U.S. citizens counted on the rolls to determine the apportionment of representatives. And the effect of that will likely be a massive increase and a rebalancing, actually, toward conservatives and Republicans. So here on this map, you can see the new U.S. House Texas map has been released, the 2026 midterms. Now, here's the point Mike Shelby makes by bringing this up, is that this kind of redistricting is actually what led to the troubles in Ireland in the 1960s and 70s after Protestants used gerrymandering to lock out Catholics. So this kind of thing is what can help to gin up civil unrest. Now, does that mean we shouldn't do it? No, we absolutely should do it. We should rebalance these maps to accurately reflect the population, but it may come with repercussions. And so the fact that Joe Kent was confirmed disrupting the networks that seek the destruction of the United States is going to become paramount. To that end, Trump-hating Russia hoax investigator fired his top NSA lawyer. Can't believe those folks are even still here in the administration 6 months in. Also, Tulsi Gabbard says a stunning document John Ratcliffe hinted at should be released, quote, very soon in an interview with Glenn Beck. It's going through declassification process right now, and it will connect a lot of dots that have not been revealed in public before. So this is not going away, the Russiagate hoax. Now, a declassified annex from the Durham report suggests that Hillary Clinton sought to falsely claim that then, I should say the Hillary Clinton campaign sought to falsely claim that then Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump had ties with the Russian government while the FBI failed to investigate the matter, according to the heads of the CIA, Justice Department, a prominent Republican senator. The documents were part of an annex to the former special counsel John Durham's 2023 report into the FBI's investigation into allegations of Trump's campaign Russia ties. The latest declassification follows the DOJ's recent disclosure of information relating to the handling of this matter, and this is a fascinating thing as well. In one of the new declassified memos, it said that the Clinton campaign, quote, approved a plan proposed by one of her foreign policy advisors to smear Donald Trump by magnifying the scandal tied to the intrusion by the Russian special services in the pre-election process to benefit the Republican candidate. The information was uncovered by Durham during his probe of the FBI and other intelligence services during that election. Based on the Durham Annex, the Obama FBI failed to adequately review and investigate intelligence reports showing the Clinton campaign may have been ginning up the fake Trump-Russia narrative for Clinton's political gain, which was ultimately done through the Steele dossier and other means, Grassley said, Senator Grassley. Now, that brings us to what the intelligence shows. And that is that part of this was a Clinton campaign plan, that it was pouring oil on a fire by amplifying the lie and burying the truth of what Hillary Clinton was up to, according to CIA Director Ratcliffe. So, what does this mean practically? Well, it means that we should ask this question. Is Hillary Clinton guilty of a criminal conspiracy conspiring with intelligence and White House officials to violate the CIA's charter and Executive Order 12333 explicitly prohibiting the agency from conducting intelligence operations against U.S. citizens within the United States? The trial can't come soon enough. Also, who was the FBI hero that saved thousands of classified Russiagate documents from destruction? The prior regime put thousands of classified documents in burn bags, but an unknown hero moved them to a secret room in the Hoover building before they could be burned. It turns out there are a few good men in the FBI after all, according to Amuse, and I couldn't agree more with that. Interesting the timing in which they were found as well. J. Michael Waller asking a question. They understand he is a counterintelligence specialist, wrote a book called Big Intel on this whole issue of the weaponization of our counterintelligence and intelligence agencies. He asked the question, what if it was Brennan who was in Putin's pocket all along? I think that the results of these investigations are going to absolutely shock people to the core. And as we press into this, remember the evidence that we're looking at is not being disputed at this point. But that the fact that we had a president of the United States who had departments and personnel who were intentionally working against him and General Flynn really gives credence to General Flynn's comment that had Trump not won the election, Trump would have been arrested on the following day, and so would General Flynn. I think that this is an important aspect to understand, that if we don't get this right, if we don't make the penalty so high, this could happen again. And especially on the 250th anniversary of our independence, coming up next year, what a better time to reevaluate, reestablish, reaffirm the principles of a republic, that no matter who's in power, that we have God-given unalienable rights, and no majority, whether they were voted in by 50.01% or 75%, can take those rights away from people. And that justice, real justice, sometimes isn't nice, but it is necessary. Which brings us to the last article today. AG Pam Bondi has filed a misconduct complaint, a formal complaint against D.C. Chief Judge James Boasberg. The charge, improper political interference in the middle of a major deportation case. And I suspect that we are going to continue to hear this kind of approach, investigation upon investigation upon investigation. But ultimately, all of us are asking the question, is there actually going to be accountability? Will someone be punished for this to the fullest extent of the law? Will these people be barred from ever trying to do this again? Will the communist and jihadi networks that are helping to fund this be actually exposed and disrupted as well? When we come back from the break, our guest, Robert Spencer.
told you you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today.
And we're back from the break with our guest today, Robert Spencer. He's the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's also an author of 29 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam, jihadwatch.org. Robert, it's great to have you back on Patriot Radio today.
Great to talk to you as always, Matt. Thank you.
So, this situation with Israel and Hamas, you have France, United Kingdom, Canada now saying that there should be a Palestinian state. The Israelis saying if the hostages don't come back soon, we're going to annex Gaza. This morning, Hamas has cut off communication with the mediators in one report that I just saw. How are you evaluating this, and what can we expect? What do you think is going to happen here in the near term?
Well, I think it's very likely that France, Canada, and the UK will indeed recognize the Palestinian state because, as President Trump quite rightly said, to do so would be rewarding Hamas's massacre of 1,200 Israeli civilians on October 7th, 2023. And those three governments are all together happy to do that. They have been in the hip pocket of the jihadis for years. They have followed a path consistently of appeasement and surrender, and this would be just another example of that. So I fully expect them to recognize the Palestinian state, but in this case, Matt, it's complete fiction. I mean, we're talking about a place that does not have a government because the Gazans don't accept the Palestinian Authority. They explicitly rejected the Palestinian Authority back in 2007, and they don't want it any more now than they did then. The Palestinian Authority, meanwhile, has a man in charge of it who is in the 20th year of his 4-year term as president.
Right.
They can't hold elections because if they hold elections, Hamas will win. And they don't want that because it presents a bad face to the world. So they don't have a government, and they're not going to have a government in the near future. They don't have borders because to have a stable and contiguous Palestinian state means taking territory away from Israel, which Israel is not involved in this. France and Canada and the UK are just going to act unilaterally and say, we're taking away part of the territory of Israel and creating a Palestinian state. It's as absurd as if Israel were to say, okay, we're going to take Normandy and make it into a Palestinian state and send all the Palestinians to France if they love them so much. And people would say, oh, well, that's absurd. You can't do that. You're violating the sovereignty of the French Republic. And that's exactly the point, that they are completely blithely ignoring the sovereignty of the Israeli state, which, like it or not, is a recognized sovereign state in the United Nations, and they don't care. So it's a complete fantasy that they are just trying to pursue because in all three cases, the governments, the far left governments that are doing this, depend upon the Muslim voters in their countries to stay in power. And that's really what it's all about. Keir Starmer would lose if it weren't for the Muslim vote in Britain. Same thing for Macron and Mark Carney. And so that's why they want a Palestinian state, to shore up their own positions domestically.
So aside from the red-green axis of the socialists in these countries allying with the jihadis in those countries, and let's be blunt about that, is there also some fear that this could, if they went against it or they actually backed Israel, that there could be increased terror attacks inside their own countries?
Oh, yeah. And fear is exactly the problem, that these governments are desperately afraid of their Muslim populations, and they have lost control of the country. Because, Matt, any population, no matter what it is, if the government's afraid of a population in the society, then the government's no longer any government to speak of. And they are pursuing these paths to try to pacify this population because they know that this population would rise up and could very easily topple them from power if they don't appease it. And so instead of having some courage, instead of ending the mass migration, instead of cracking down and making sure that everybody in the country understands that there's one law for all the people in the country, and if you don't obey it, then you were going to be on the wrong side of it and pay the penalty there for being on the wrong side of it. They're afraid to do that, and so appeasement is the only thing they've got left.
So the argument in the legacy media right now is that there's always been a Palestinian state, or at least a claim to a Palestinian state, but history really doesn't bear that out, does it?
No, it's total fantasy. There has never, in the history of the world, been a Palestinian state. There weren't even Palestinians until 1964. And people dispute this, but people who dispute this demonstrate by doing so that they have no historical knowledge. Because if you go back to 1948, when the State of Israel was founded, and you look at all the many, many arguments and discussions and debates that were held around the founding of the State of Israel at the United Nations and elsewhere, not once does anybody mention Palestinians. If you go back in history into the 19th century and the 18th and the 17th and all the way back, nobody ever mentions Palestinians. Why not? Because they didn't exist. They are a propaganda invention of the KGB and Yasser Arafat, developed in 1964 in order to buttress the idea that this was really their land and this tiny nationality was facing this huge Israeli war machine that was trying to take away their sovereignty, when really what they want is the destruction of the Jewish state and the establishment of a 23rd Arab state. The Palestinians are no different ethnically, religiously, culturally, or historically from the Arabs of Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And so the whole idea that there was ever a Palestinian state, it completely founders on history. There was the mandate for Palestine. Palestine was the name of the region, never a nationality. Like Staten Island, there's not a Staten Island ethnicity or nationality either. It's just an area. And the mandate for Palestine was given to Britain after World War I explicitly for the creation of a Jewish national home in that region. And nowadays, people take coins from that mandate for Palestine or money or some other thing that says Palestine, and they say, see, that was a Palestinian state. This could only possibly fool people who have no historical sense and don't realize what they're looking at, that this was actually a creation of the League of Nations, passed over to the United Nations expressly to pave the way for the State of Israel.
Why then is there the argument in the legacy media right now, and even in the United Nations, that this is just the natural response to Jewish colonialism? And how do you address that?
Well, there isn't any colonialism. It's just like the Palestinians. There aren't any Palestinians. The colonialism. Okay, if you take colonialists if you consider what the word means, that is, then you are talking about people who are from another place coming and taking over a land and asserting political authority over the indigenous people. Well, the indigenous people of that land are actually the Jews. And there is abundant historical and archaeological evidence for that. Bill Maher, of all people, just was calling to this, saying, if you don't believe that the Jews are the indigenous people of the land, just look at the Bible. Now, I don't even think he's a believer, but the fact is that as a historical document, the Bible bears witness to the presence of the Jews in that land from time immemorial. So you're not talking about colonialists from somewhere else. The idea that the Arabs are the indigenous people of the land ignores the fact that there were no Arabs there until the 7th century, that they came as colonialist conquerors and they took over the land then. And the history of their presence there cannot conceivably go back before that. So if you're talking about colonials, they're the actual colonialists.
So, well, and that's the history of Islam breaking out of the Arabian Peninsula Dr. Bill Warner does a fantastic job with his dynamic battle map, showing all the battles and then showing the very few crusade battles. So that's absolutely historic fact. The I think issue in a lot of people's minds is, why does the United Nations constantly attack Israel but never really go after some of these Islamic countries? And where I'm really headed here is, I think people miss the fact that the OIC and the Socialist International have an outsized influence in that body.
That's exactly it, Matt. That's exactly what I was going to say. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is the largest voting bloc at the UN ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. And so you're right that there is a hangover of the Socialist International, but also the OIC. And of course, they work hand in glove because they have a common enemy in the United States and its allies as the foremost exponents of freedom in the world. And so with the OIC being the main voting bloc at the UN, essentially the UN has become a rubber stamp of the Islamic agenda. And all the UN officials are aware of this. The UN, of course, has now a terrible scandal that it's trying to cover up of the UN Relief and Works Association, the UNRWA, that is the Palestinian Refugee Organization, was actually actively aiding Hamas in its jihad against Israel, with UNRWA teachers being members of Hamas, teaching jihad and hatred of Israel to the students, and then going out and killing Israelis. This was all winked at by the UN. And so you listen to Antonio Guterres, and he is spouting Hamas propaganda. It's not an accident. It's because he knows where the real influence is and where the real power is behind the UN today.
You have several Arab countries right now calling for Hamas to step down out of power in any really appreciable manner. You have Israel saying that they want to annex the Gaza Strip. Do you think that's actually going to happen? Do you think Hamas is going to step down, or do you think that they're actually going to have to be driven out?
Hamas is going to have to be driven out. Hamas will never step down, will never surrender, because Hamas is a group of Islamic jihadis, and there is no surrender for Islamic jihadis. Islamic jihadis may pause, they may agree to a truce, a ceasefire, a treaty that will allow them to regroup and gain strength so as to fight again more effectively later. But they will never sign a paper saying the war is over, we will not fight you anymore, and pursue peace, unless it's a deceptive tactic. And so Hamas is going to have to be destroyed. And even when Hamas is destroyed, other jihad groups will arise in its place. That's not to say Hamas should not be destroyed. It would be a tremendous setback, a huge loss for the jihad movement worldwide if Hamas were destroyed. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this furious hysteria against Israel right now, because Hamas really is on the ropes. And the jihadis are looking at a catastrophic loss that would be bigger than anything they've suffered in the last 100 years or more. And so they're trying everything they can to stave that off, with, of course, the help of clueless, useful idiot Western leftists who have no idea how they're being played.
Since 1917, 1918 timeframe, absolutely. When we come back from the break, more with our guest, Robert Spencer, jihadwatch.org. We're going to talk about the ongoing attacks in Europe and what does that mean for the United States of America.
What if I told you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today.
And we're back with our guest today, Robert Spencer, jihadwatch.org. Ongoing attacks happening in Europe. Very likely, most recently, a member of the Garda in Ireland, in Dublin on patrol, had a knife attack, life-threatening injuries. However, it really clearly looked, at least from the video, that it was a jihad attack. It's been happening in Europe 3-4 times a week right now. What does this mean for the United States of America? And for our allies in Europe, like Britain, France, and even Ireland.
Well, Britain and France and Ireland as well are going to see more and more of this. The more Muslims they bring in, the more jihadis they bring in. The more jihadis they bring in, the more ISIS they bring in. And ISIS has repeatedly called upon Muslims in the West to do exactly this kind of thing. Take a knife, go out onto the street, stab random people, scream Allahu Akbar, make it clear that you are doing it in order to strike terror in the enemies of Allah, as the Quran directs. This is something that not only ISIS but Al-Qaeda has called for. And there is no recognition of this on the part of those governments. They are all totally asleep about it. They all classify these jihadis again and again and again as mentally ill and put them in psychiatric hospitals because they don't want to admit that there even exists such a concept as Islamic Jihad. They don't want to admit that they are in the crosshairs of that Islamic Jihad, and consequently they have to classify these people as something, and so they say they're crazy. It's not going to make the problem go away. It's just going to fill the mental hospitals with Islamic jihadis, and ultimately something's going to have to give. The United States, we are looking at the same things happening here. We are just a little bit farther down the road because the Muslim population of the United States is smaller proportionately to the Muslim population in those countries. But we should not kid ourselves. Everywhere in the world, for 1,400 years, wherever there are Muslims living with non-Muslims, Muslims behave violently and attack the non-Muslims. This is a teaching of Islam. It is very clear in the Quran and the example of Muhammad. The West is in total denial about it, even to the point of demonizing, stigmatizing, and silencing those who are calling attention to it. But that's not going to make it go away. Everywhere that Muslims and non-Muslims live, there's conflict caused by the Muslims. We will not be exempt. It's coming here.
Islamophobia is actually a creation just in the last 15, 20 years that was an intentional active measure against those that would raise the alarm. And so I want to talk about this just in great detail right now. In The Reliance of the Traveler, as you know, it's the foremost authoritative translation of Sunni Islamic law. It defines jihad as warfare against non-Muslims. But yet we hear quite frequently that, no, that's just radical Muslims. And Lara Logan actually had a sitting congressman, Eli Crane, say that, and she said, actually, there's no such thing as radical Islam. How do you approach this issue, and what should people be educated on when they hear those kind of words come out and that kind of rhetoric?
Well, you know what? I heard about Lara Logan. I want to congratulate and thank her. She's absolutely right. And it's so rare to hear that kind of thing said in the public square. And she's to be applauded for her courage. But it's really just common sense. The Reliance of the Traveler that you mentioned has a certification that it conforms to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community that comes from the highest Islamic authority in Saudi Arabia, as well as in Egypt and in Jordan. And so a book that's got certification from the highest Islamic authorities in 3 of the most important Muslim countries says that it's a reliable guide to Sunni Islam, and it says jihad is warfare against and the subjugation of unbelievers. And this is something that is echoed by every other significant Islamic authority around the world. All the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, all the various different sects, aside from a very tiny minority of groups that reject violence, including the Ahmadiyya, the Ismaili Shia, and so on, who are about 1% to 2% of all the Muslims in the world. So you got 98, 99% all think that they need to wage war to subjugate non-Muslims and extend the hegemony of Islamic law to them. You've got all the major authorities saying that. You've got an unbroken historical string of Islamic authorities, teachers, commentators on the Quran, and so on, saying that. You've got the Quran saying that. You've got Muhammad acting on that. That's mainstream Islam. There's nothing radical about it. They are not taking a peaceful religion and interpreting it in a radical way. And this is why it's misleading and false to talk about radical Islam, because there ain't nothing radical about it. It is just ordinary Islam as it is taught in the Quran and Sunnah, the primary authorities for Muslims. There are many Muslims who don't go out and kill, and we can be glad of that, but that doesn't mean that they have some sort of a nonviolent understanding of Islam. They're just not following the teachings that call for violence and the subjugation of unbelievers.
So that naturally brings up the question, especially in the West. It sounds like you guys are discussing things that would lead ultimately to some sort of banning of Islam, or even more nefariously, cracking down on freedom of religion. And here you are, Christians who believe in freedom of religion. How do you address when people bring that up?
Well, I think the freedom of religion is very important, but it's not a license to break existing laws. And there have been very clear distinctions made in the past regarding the limits of freedom of religion. Consider the fact that Utah only was allowed to become a state when the Mormon Church outlawed polygamy. When the Mormon Church was teaching polygamy, the United States government said, Utah will not be a state. And the Mormons said, but what about our freedom of religion? And they did not interpret the freedom of religion as a license to transgress against the common good as they saw it. And it's the same thing now. If we say to the Muslims, you have perfect freedom of religion, that is absolutely true, and that is in accord with the U.S. Constitution. But once again, it is not some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card to do whatever they want. And killing in the name of Allah, subjugating unbelievers, raping women, all these things and more that are allowed by Quranic teaching, it has to be understood. You leave those things at the door. You are perfectly free to pray and read the Quran and believe Muhammad is a prophet, but that ends where you start infringing upon the rights of others. And so every last aspect of Islam that involves infringing upon the rights of others has to be left outside.
So like Texas, Washington State, honor killings or attempted honor killings. In fact, there's a trial, I think, going on right now, actually over in Olympia on this issue. This is criminal behavior that you're specifically talking about. But I've heard a lot of people say that they don't even really believe in honor killings. And I'm not just saying that as hyperbole. I've seen it written in newspapers. I've seen it written online articles. Honor killings is just our perspective of it. That's not actually what happened. This is just domestic violence in a different form. What's the distinction there?
Well, honor killing is a very specific phenomenon that is very different from domestic violence, because it can happen. Domestic violence ordinarily involves somebody's temper getting out of control and becoming violent in that regard. Honor killing can be done when somebody's completely calm and decides that the behavior of usually it's a young woman, has transgressed against the family's honor, and the family's honor can only be cleansed by her being put to death. This is something that is taught in the Quran, where there's a mysterious figure in chapter 18 who kills a boy. This guy is walking around with Moses, the prophet, and Moses is appalled and asks him, why did you kill the boy? And he says, because he was disobedient to Allah, and his parents are obedient to Allah, they deserved better children. And so that's Quranic sanction for the idea of putting to death a child who is disobedient. And there are many Islamic countries that have reduced penalties for honor killing as opposed to ordinary killings. And so we have seen this in Texas. There were two sisters, Amina and Sarah Saeed, who were dating non-Muslim boys, and their father, Yasser Saeed, murdered them for doing that. He was cleansing the family honor. We have seen it happen with Aksa Parvez in Mississauga, Ontario, where she refused to wear the headscarf, the hijab, and her father and brother strangled her with the hijab she would not wear. And there are other examples of honor killings in North America. This is an ongoing phenomenon. If we say, oh, it's the freedom of religion, they can do that, then more women are going to be victimized and brutalized in this way. And if you think that's unbelievable, just consider the fact that female genital mutilation is something that is sanctioned in Islam. A couple of doctors in Detroit went on trial for it a few years ago, and a judge threw the case out on religious freedom grounds. This is a drastic misuse of the freedom of religion. We have to understand that the freedom of religion ends where the rights of these women and other laws begin. FGM is or was illegal, should be illegal, and then not practiced in the United States, even by people who say this is part of our religion.
Robert Spencer, thank you so much. Always an enlightening conversation. Appreciate you bringing the facts and the history to the table. And as always, we thank you and keep up the fight.
Always good to talk to you, man. Thank you.
JihadWatch.org. Robert Spencer, what can you do? Check out JihadWatch.org. Subscribe there as well. Monitor it. He brings up articles from all over the world, but particularly in the United States and in Canada, that most people are missing or go way, way underreported. So we talked about maybe a difficult thing for some of you today. So the other thing that you can do right now is educate your friends and family on what we talked about, that language is important, that there's no such thing as radical Islam. There's people just following the teachings that are compiled in the reliance of the traveler. And that there are some people maybe that don't follow the teachings, just like there's Christians that don't follow the teachings of the Bible. But that doesn't make the history of Islam any less violent. And it doesn't make the infiltration of jihadis into the United States of America to overthrow the Constitution any less real. So as we talk about these things, let's talk about facts and history. We bring the truth, we bring it in love, but it's still the truth. And the agreement as Americans that we all have should be to uphold the Constitution of the United States, which brings the most freedom and the most protection of God-given unalienable rights to the most people. And that no matter who is in power, whether they're voted in by a 50.01% majority or not, those rights continue to exist and will never be voted away. That's what it means to defend Christendom and Western civilization. This is Matt Shea. Thank you for joining me on Patriot Radio today. May God bless all of you. He is making this generation the greatest one. The awakening is here. So keep up the fight.